Okay, goedemiddag ook. Good afternoon. Yesterday was the opening of your show at Max, and your first big solo show in Belgium. But it's not the first time you are in Belgium, and in preparing this talk, I remember very lively an interview I once read by the end of the 90s, I guess, in Fleja. By the end of the 90s, you were quite famous already, but you were talking about the 80s, where museums in the United States were not that much interested in video art. And then you said something about except those weird guys in Belgium and Holland, and you meant also Gent, the Museum of Hedendaagse Kunst here in Ghent, that were interested in your work. That's correct? Eh?
That's right. There was always, I felt a much stronger interest in experimental work in general in Europe. I've often tried to wonder why that is. But I think it's a kind of almost a tradition, like Malin and Kanchi also had bigger lives in Europe before they had things happen in the US. So I think it's a two-part question. One is that new media, the way that it becomes incorporated into the organ of culture, which is the institution, and why the difference between European and American culture in relation to that. But I always felt like America was much slower with that. It's dynamic because everybody, probably in the US, people had more televisions than anywhere else. But they couldn't see, they had I think the statistics were 2 or 3 televisions in every house. Yet they couldn't see that as a place for making culture happen. It's very fascinating.
But you studied at CalArts. You were born in New York. How did you come up in California for your studies?
It was really, I think a lot of artists have these fortuitous moments in their career, and one of those was I was going to high school, and I kind of got out of high school to go to a small community college. In my last year of high school, I met a wonderful professor there who suggested I go to CalArts, and that seemed an impossibility, but through a funny set of circumstances, I ended up going, 3,000 miles away from New York to California, and to that wonderful place, CalArts, which was sort of the end of the road of American culture. Timothy Leary used to say, well, once after California, the next place is space.
Then you went first to painting classes, and then somewhere on the road you find a camera.
Yeah, I always was a painter since I was a little kid, and then after mathematics failed me, I kind of, certain doors close and certain doors open for people in education in different ways. And I really wanted to be a scientist, but I had no mathematics really, so that forced me to go into some other direction. And for whatever reason, the painting seemed really strong. I liked it. You could be your own boss, sort of.
Yeah. And where happened the transition between painting and video art or new media?
Yeah, I had very naive ideas about painting. There was no way to. I think artists, they really have to experience the totality of the history of art when they're young in some way or another. And so I had this strange idea of how I could, sort of paint photorealistically before I could paint abstractly, these strange ideas that a 17-year-old would have, And so then dropped into this heavy conceptual art situation of CalArts. I immediately gravitated towards professors like John Baldessari and he, you know, people just suggested, well, try this, try that. So I was immediately doing kind of performance, sound things, picking up cameras, film cameras, video cameras. But when I got the video camera, you know, we kind of, one of our themes is context here today. And you have to imagine in 1976, some of the younger people will find this hard to imagine. One was unable to, I mean, I had never seen a video camera before in my hand to record something and play it back, ever. And until I was in this art department at Cal Arts, and they had a 10-year-old camcorder.
The Portapack?
Yeah, it's a Portapack, which was invented in 1967, I believe.
Hans was the only one, the only artist who had already in '64 kind of experimental Portapack Sony, because he was Korean. And that's in '67 it became more available.
I believe.
Yeah.
And so I got it 10 years after that, but it was still quite obscure, and the camera was, of course, filtered through a film department and completely beat up. So it was already like war-torn for 10 years, and had, you know, people won't even know this, but the tube that recorded at that time was very sensitive. If you pointed it at this projector, it would get burned, like the retina of your eye, but except permanently burned. So even if you just left the lens cap off and some kind of light came into it, you could scar an image into the camera. It's very weirdly organic and kind of made these beautiful gray, very Luke Toyman kind of images, you know, floating, and transformed everything. You know, if you took a shot of this, you know, it became like a great lake in Switzerland, you know, and you know, it's just fantastic because there was, the information was denuded, but somehow reinvigorated with the interpretation of the image. So I picked that camera up and I never really looked back. You know, all the painting ideas that I had and the performative things that were percolating in the back of my mind, and the fact that I knew in my heart in some way that painting did not address the culture that I lived in, which was a multimedia culture, rock and roll, cinematic, television.
This brings me also, during your education in Cal Arts, you met with, amongst others, Mike Kelly, and you started also a rock band, The Poetics.
Yeah, exactly. And that's my second rock band. I had one in 5th grade, which was, you know, quite strange, Catholic school rock band with singing Led Zeppelin and original tunes. But then at Cal Arts, I met Mike, which was a really wonderful friend, and that was the beginning of our friendship. Was Mike saying, you know, he had seen some of my videotapes, and he said, "Oh, I like your voice. You know, you should be a singer in a band." And a little louder. Okay. So you should be a singer in a band. I looked at him and I'm like, that's an interesting projection. Well, I have been a singer, but anyway, so we got a band together called The Poetics, which was a very loosely knit, experimental, really performance group. We did soundtracks for the radio. We worked with Douglas Hubler on a radio show. We did dance pieces, performance pieces. We did soundtracks for performance for other people's work. It was just kind of a think tank, kind of male bonding, you know, way of kind of working through ideas. And of course, we revisited that again in '97. You know, the band lasted from '76 or '7 to the, you know, '84 or something, I think was recording, and then we kind of petered out and did a few things here and there, but then jumped back into it, recorded new albums, and did a giant installation for Catherine David's Documenta, which was just a wonderful time. And as you mentioned, some of the byproducts of that are on Uber Web, the interviews which I did. that synesthesia.
Yeah. But before the documenta 10 of Catherine David and the documenta 9 of Tony Oursler, of Jan Hood, which was your first documenta, I guess, also in 8 maybe, with the video program. Obscure video program. Maybe the exhibition in Grand Rue starts with one video from the 80s. That's, well, it starts with a work from 2013. And then the first thing you see is a monitor with this video, The Loner, from 1980, which is like, I think, a good example for the type of videos you were making during those years, during the 80s, where you were still not that known. You still had to teach also, I guess, to earn your money. But it was like, yeah, the rock and roll ages in New York, and a lot of things could happen.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can see the connection between painting and I was very interested in that moment in cinematic history where magic and theater moved into the moving image. You know, I always thought that there were two directions, Lumiere and Méliès, and one sort of traveled inside and made images, and one went out and made sort of documentary images. And of course, you could see the path I took, which was more interiorized and looking at a different way of making a narrative line. You know, I was never really satisfied with close-up, medium shot, long shot as a narrative structure, and was attracted to all these people in experimental film who looked in another direction. But
it was also like a little bit like homemade, with cardboard, and with all your friends playing in it, playing characters in it.
Yes, it was always kind of looking at the cabinet of Dr. Caligari and the way that these images went from reading as one thing and then deconstructing to kind of handmade object at the same time. I always liked that kind of the V effect that Brecht talks about in theater, which has to do with realizing that you're sort of interpreting something as you're watching it, which makes it more real in some way.
And you were talking about, you dropped the word magic or magician.
Yeah.
Your grandfather was a magician.
He was. Yeah.
And he was also what's the word, ventriloquist?
Ventriloquist, sure, and he was also a writer.
And he knew Houdini.
He did actually know Houdini. I didn't know him, he just was a large figure in my background, my grandfather, because he was Fulton, the senior. He was gone by the time I was born, but he lived large as this figure who was, did all sorts of things. This particularly interesting work that he did in around religion, around some politics, mystery writing, and also magic. So, and particularly he and Houdini were interested in debunking spiritualists, or psychics who were sort of con men. And so he was interested in magic, as was Houdini, but they had kind of parting of the ways in that culture. Some people claimed to really be able to produce magic, and other people claimed that it was artifice, And of course, Houdini went the artifice route and went to great lengths to kind of crush these con men psychics. And me and my grandfather did a little bit of that together.
And I understand as an artist working with video, it's about this magic, it's about that fantasy, about this surrealism in a way. But at the same time, also in the exhibition in Max, there's also, like in the press text, focus on the occult, spiritualism, and so on. But at the other hand, you seem to be like a very rational person. How do you combine those two approaches of in yourself and in your work?
Well, the key there is that I've always been interested in it. My subject matter has often been related to kind of ontological systems and the way that people decide to perceive and interpret the world. So I'm interested in magical thinking, which of course is a psychology term, not a prestidigitation term. But I guess that's what attracts me to it, you know, is this way that I think any artist needs to know the way people view the world in one way or another, and they pick areas to look at that because we have a kind of visual, psychological perspective and work. And my particular intuitive shoot from the hip way of doing it is to kind of get interested in subject matter, and whether it's the way cults sort of persuade people to believe in things that are obviously quite outside normal belief systems, or whether it is our investment in looking into the internet and staring at a screen, you know, at computer screens or flat phones for, you know, 1/3 of the day. This is what's kind of preoccupying me now. So this is a kind of a system of belief and activity, which has always sort of informed my work. I kind of pick a topic, research it for a year or two, and work spins out of that. So, but the occult is something that I've gone back to a couple of times.
And it's also obvious, and also in your videos already in the 80s, where you have these weird scenarios. That was the thing I was questioning myself during the last few days when I was reviewing all those videos that are on the internet. So it's interesting to know on Google Web you can see 5-6 examples of those works of the 80s, which are quite long,
Yeah.
often a little bit annoying sometimes. So, what was it? Because it brings me also a little bit to the catalog. It's a fantastic catalog that Max nu together with Mercatorfonds edited, which is an anthology of well, a selection of a lot of your works, where all the texts that are produced in the works are written down. I think for the first time.
Yeah.
Such a complete anthology.
Oh yeah.
And what you see, so I can advise to everybody, there's also a fantastic graphic design, and it reminds me a little bit, I think somebody you don't know, but Paul van Ostaaij, our like concrete poëzie, the concrete poetry, like in the 20s and 30s here, where you have like things like this, poetry was often at the core of the work.
Well, what's beautiful about this book, besides Simon and Petra's design, which is really fabulous, and Dennis and Laurent's introductions, but what we tried to do is have a description. Dennis really wanted not just to have the transcriptions of the voices from the works, but to also have description of what the ideas were at the time. So we worked quite a bit on getting these descriptions of each body of work. And most of them are represented in there. There's some...
So there were no leftovers of a scenario written down. You really had to transcribe it from the video.
Well, there were, I mean, it was two things. One was the transcription of the language. The other was the description of that body of work and what I was thinking about at the time I made that. So that's what makes this, it's also quite unique in that not only has there's been a few transcriptions here and there, but just to go back, people familiar with my work will know there's always some kind of voice battle. Oh, fuck you, something like this.
I have it here.
Yeah.
I get away. Yeah. The fuck you. Yeah.
And that's particularly one body of work which is voicing kind of inner thoughts in a way. And each body of work that I made, some of course have no language. For example, the eye projections. Some are of course just wall works and they have no language. But many of them have language, and it's strange dynamic because when I started working on the book, I had mentioned to people, you know, I've been working on it for like a year, transcribing these things, and I said to somebody, you know, a curator who knew my work, and I was like, she's like, what are you doing? I said, I'm doing a book of my scripts, you know, 50 scripts, a selection of 50 scripts or text from 30 years. And she looked at me like I was on the moon. Because sometimes the work, I think people just ignore the fact that there's even language in it, or they think that the language just comes from nowhere, which is accidental or something like that. Because, and I've been studying this, you know, a lot of ideas about the brain and the way we perceive language and images and things through the years, because I think that's really where a lot of what's happening today in imagery and ideas is really neuro transmissions in a way. So one thing I discovered was that when you're actually reading something, you shut off the image part of your brain, and when you're looking at something, you shut off the language part of your brain, which I had never known. I know that people have a lot of trouble with image text work, you know, and certain people are violently against it, and just they're like, that image text work, you know. But I have this kind of oral thing happening, which is more akin to music and poetry. And so I think that sometimes people, they just switch it off. Of course, here in Europe, because it's mostly in English, I've done things in many other languages, but it's easier for people to just shut it off and look at it. So it's like a faucet, you know, this like babble comes out. And but to go back to where the language comes from, it's each different body of work. I try to find a different strategy of vocalization, of performance. For example, with the Influence Machine, I did a lot of research with psychics because I was interested in how psychics talk to the dead. So I went and visited these very unique individuals who communicate with the dead. And I studied exactly how they talk to the dead, which was quite unique, you know. So they would say, I have a message for you, are you ready? Okay, you ready? There's an old man with gray hair who has something to say to you. You want to hear it? You know, like this. So there's a kind of cadence involved with different languages of communication, different modes of communication. For example, what I call the bubble series, which is like the donuts or these kind of stretched faces. They are about very intimate language, you know, a kind of private language that lovers have, a language that exists between somebody and a pet, you know, how people talk to pets, which is often really embarrassing. No, turn it off, stop, you know, you can't take it. So I try to find these different ways in, and of course the mattress works. It was, you know, I had done a kind of before that I was working with just emotions, you know, so there was really no language. I called it the sublingual series. And so it would just be crying or moaning or sexual passionate sounds or even animal sounds. And then I started thinking about these kind of looping neurotic voices like, get away from you, I gotta get away from that, blah, blah, blah. So each one has a perspective. For example, you put up this one here with David Bowie and Tony Oursler on the left from Documenta, and Bowie from a few years later, 5 years later. And these were very deconstructive interpretations of cinematic culture. So I had this idea at the time. I was living with Joe Gibbons in Boston and I was teaching. This was my year zero moment that we talked about. And we were making a movie, like a feature movie, like a lot of artists like this rite of passage. we're gonna make a feature movie, get out of the art world, make a movie, get
Have you
take it
succeeded?
to the people. No, he succeeded, and it stars Karen Finley and Tony Conrad and myself and Jonas and numerous other characters. It's a feature film called The Genius, and Joe plays in it himself. It's a wonderful movie. But at the time I was thinking, I had ideas about fantasy about making a movie, and then I thought, well, it's much more interesting when you talk to somebody about a movie and they tell you the parts of the movie that they like, and then you kind of imagine these scenarios, So you take like a $100 million Spielberg movie, and then somebody's at the water cooler on Monday and they're explaining, oh yeah, there's a really good part in that where, the dragon takes somebody into space and this happens and that happens. So I really like that. Putting it back into the everyman, the person at the water cooler on Monday, and the way that they own that kind of culture, the way they edit it, and the way they make their own narrative out of it. So I started to write these pieces, which were, they were almost like translators of this media, and it becomes invented in the mind of the viewer.
Well, in another interview, you make the distinctions between an audience and a participant. That you say that, like, cinema has an audience, feature movies have an audience, and an exhibition visitor is a participant. Absolutely. He has to finish your work, also to participate in it.
I mean, that's something I hold on to every day, because it's the way art and artists fit into culture, and these kind of institutions fit into culture is really wonderful, but it's also, I'm very interested in crossover, what becomes art in popular culture and what popular culture becomes art. I'm really interested in that, but I'm also very interested in the position, like what makes the difference between art and pop culture. And to me, that's it. When you pay your ticket to go into the Spielberg movie or what have you, it's really, you are just taken for a ride, which you're meant to feel certain things along the way, and you're not a participant in the larger sense of the word that we have in S.M.A.K here. And so it's good for me to think about that's an important place, and I think that's why art institutions have gotten bigger and bigger in the past 15 or 20 years, that more and more people are interested in art, because as people get better and better at producing video games that are very manipulative and addictive and time-consuming, and ingeniously figuring out ways of separating you from your money and you from your time and creativity, that there's an alternative, and people intuit that in arts institutions. So they bring their children, they go, because they know they're getting something different.
Talking about video games, it brings me to this amazing, I go a little bit, this was here at S.M.A.K, this is in Gent.S.M.A.K, but this one, Phantasmagoria, it's also the title of the exhibition in Gent.S.M.A.K, and I think we can be very proud of having those institutions also like S.M.A.K here in Belgium, because they acquired, they produced partly this work, and they have it for the collection of the French-speaking part of Belgium, and the collection of S.M.A.K's. A huge installation, a whole room, 7.5 meters by 44 meters. And it's big. And I have like 4 slides of it. So this is what you first see, is like this satellite disc with mirrors, that reflects all kinds of images. Then behind it, I have no detail of it, is this, go further into that, this kind of video game. Is it?
Yeah, it's
one of the shooting games.
Yeah, first-person shooter. It's zombies.
And then you have like this robot pictures, and then at the end we have a kind of devil, I guess, in the middle with a spider web and a projection of a snake. And at the back of the room we have like 2 projections, 2 women talking in French, and it was especially made also in French.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Performing a kind of psychology test.
Maybe you talk us through this amazing installation, because it's like quite recently that you made those almost, I wouldn't say baroque, but like very complex
Yeah, well, it was a real wonderful situation that Laurent and Dennis figured out at the museum. You know, we figured that it was a kind of model for production that we could produce the objects in Grand Ornu using the craft people there. They have an incredible carpentry team and some of the Belgian artisans working on it, as well as some of the kids from the art school, and then also down even to a level of 8-year-olds in the local schools, 8 and 13-year-olds. So there was a whole range of people who became involved with the project, and this was really just a special thing because it was designed for the long room there. And Dennis and Laurent and I discussed not only making a unique book, which they achieved quite spectacularly in my mind, because they said, okay, we're a small institution, you know, we can't just do another catalog, we want to do something that's different. So, and they took that perspective also to the artwork. And, you know, I had done with the Influence Machine in the 90s and the Timeline, which I wrote, which was a kind of shadow history of the moving image, a kind of interest in like saying that, okay, I'm a media artist, but there's some kind of histories written about media arts, but there needs to be a bigger, all-inclusive history written. You know, if we're going to open up, we're going to say like painting is one thing, but now we're going to look at the history of the moving image as well, and take some Madame Curie and Gaspar Robertson as artists and look at what they did, because and future artists are going to want to know about that, because that's as important as Leonardo or Van Gogh or something like that. And so I wrote this timeline, and I discovered this fellow, Gaspar Robertson, who's fascinating.
Somebody from Liège, Belgium.
Yeah.
Liège.
And he was not the inventor of, but the purveyor of the Phantasmagoria, which was a pre-cinematic event where people would go into, I guess he had a deconsecrated crypt where he did this performance.
This was the end of the 18th century, yeah? 1790s,
Yes.
something like this. Yeah.
And it traveled all over, I think even to the US, not his particular thing, but variations on it. And it was a kind of fad all around Europe, the Phantasmagoria. And people would come in and there would be a mixture of performance, projected magic lanterns, which you can imagine this is pre-electricity, so it had to do with torches and lens optics and things like this. Also, they had automatons in the performance, musical automatons. They had also the glass harmonica, which is a very wonderful sounding musical. So it was a kind of immersive, it's basically installation art happening in the 1790s, in my mind. Or that's my interpretation. Only written descriptions and etchings exist because it's pre-photography, and some of the slides, I believe, still exist. But it was basically kind of also an interesting moment when I researched Robertson's attitude towards what he was trying to do, which was in the Age of Enlightenment. Of course, he didn't know it at the time, but that was the spirit of the moment, was the transition from a kind of ritual, religious ritual, superstitious space into a scientific interpretation of the world and the age of enlightenment and reason. So that happens with him in a very personal way, because he got some occult books and tried to summon the devil. And of course he was unable to do it after some weeks of hanging out in his apartment, doing some sort of rituals, making circles on the floor and lighting candles. And he gets angry, he says in his autobiography, that he couldn't do it. He curses the devil and he decides to learn about optics and summon the devil through artifice. And this is the way that he ends up producing the Phantasmagoria. So I thought, okay, it's not only was at the time, but it was also this kind of crossroads. I like to imagine it as a crossroads in culture, which was happening in various ways all around. But I also was thinking that, you have a kind of change. It's also arguably the beginning of psychology happening around that time. And there's a change in the way that we perceive the world around us, that these things that were, connected to fears that were institutionalized in religion and superstition were then free-floating. And I like to think of it as letting these things out of the conscious into a kind of play space for people to work with and to form into a new reality. And this was my idea about what the Phantasm.
And do you see a similarity with what's happening now? It's the
Well,
insert of the video game and the internet and
that's exactly it.
realization.
So that, so this was my interest in the 90s, in the late 90s around this was one thing, which I'm not going to go into now, which goes to the influence machine and so forth, but I've spoken about a lot. But then I wanted to return to that, and because I kind of thought, well, there's also, it's a kind of crossroads now, and let's return to the notion of the Phantasmagoria, because we have, arguably these fears and phantasmagorical image production are around us in every way, starting with the internet, I guess, which is a kind of, I see it as a kind of collective image space, a kind of new mirror. And the mirror, when you look in the mirror, you see a reflection of yourself, but you also see it denuded itself, whereas the mirror in the past was about building the self. The self now is in question and a kind of replaceable, iconic reflection. So that's one of the themes of this piece. So I sort of was looking at what happens today. Here's the everyman facing his superstitions. Then in the background we have the kids'
drawings,
which you can't see too clearly here, but this was the 13-year-olds and the 8-year-olds roughly doing images of their fears. And so looking at how technology and media culture has infiltrated that. So you have these kind of wonderful, naive drawings, but that say something about our moment. And what I want to do is develop a small archive at the museum there from the education department and just use that as a way of kind of charting this evolution, because we live in a kind of secular culture with immediacy of information and information glut. And so what's happening now? What's our position now in terms of technology, the self, image production, and our relationship to fellow humans in the infotainment landscape that we live in. So the theme of the piece is the new Phantasmagoria. It has, as I was mentioning, a kind of neurological aspect to it. One of the pieces also over here has a functional MRI. It's behind the devil figure, but yeah, if you go back one, there's this gray shape is actually a functional MRI, which if
what's
you
an MRI?
Magnetic resonance imaging, which you've seen. It's a kind of reading of the electrical impulses of the brain. And to me, this is, as I mentioned, the new frontier, because they're actually able to, in a way, do a sort of mind reading in that, which is that if I show you 10 objects on this table, the bottle, the cup, the cap, this, while I'm running a functional MRI on your brain, which is a real-time reading of the brain, then 10 minutes later, if I say, okay, now think of any of those objects, I can tell you exactly what you're thinking. So it's of course not exactly mind reading, but it's the beginning of a kind of new interpretation of the brain and of privacy.
The way it comes close to God, to the principle of God, and well, in several interviews, also in your biography, you are referring to your Catholic education and also with your parents, this religious atmosphere as a kid, you experienced as a kid. How far does this take you, or is it like still in your backpack? And
there's a lot of interesting writing about that in relation to the brain, you know, these kind of near-death experiences and things like that. But those are questions that, of course, everyone has to answer personally. I'm more interested in the systems of belief, like how it would be that people would take, for example, in terms of the brain itself, there's a lot of writing about near-death experience and whether near-death experience proves that there's some kind of afterlife or higher power. And then there's also the scientific point of view, which disproves that. You know. So it's still, as you mentioned, it is a kind of battle taking place right down to the neurons. You know.
I'd like to take us back to one picture that's also a huge installation that you often remake in situ for a specific space, and there it's almost at the end of the exhibition you have this marvelous square space where you have I don't know, 10, 13 maybe projections of those eyes, which one was also here in the mid-90s. And what was interesting, because I saw you moving a little bit the eyes, the balls yesterday during the opening, to have this kind of eclipse light around, to have this. It's a very plastic, a very sculptural attitude also that you, even if you're working with this new media, and there I was also thinking about the early Tony Oursler working with this cardboard and this small scenographies, and this is still the same in a way.
I mean, I'm very interested in sculpture and the physical world, because there's a way that, I always felt that there was a moment when things would come out of the computer, come out of the TV screen, come out of the movie screen into reality, and that border is blurred. And that's, of course, the story of the 20th century. It's still continuing that way. Everybody has a glowing phone in their pocket, and this work here, really, it's one of my more direct interpretations of passive viewing. And so,
with the reflection of a television set, is it always in every eye?
In every eye, there's either a computer screen or a telephone or so there's a little reflection in there. So it's about this eating process, the kind of endless nurturing that we have to do, this endless fascination with the escapist and interiority of human culture. But there's also the notion of projection in these, which is there's a kind of physical, like the physical orb, and then the coding of the projection, and then sometimes they blend with more than one object, So it's also a kind of interruption in the way that we classically see, the light comes down, reflects off of this wood, goes into my eye, I interpret it in that way. But when there's an interruption of a third image, then hopefully we have the combination and something else happens beyond the two images.
Also, the whole history of you have a practice of 35 years, let's say, and it's also like a kind of history of the technological evolutions of everything, that's like from TV sets or monitors, or the first projectors and the mini projectors that you are using. And now also these video games you're reflecting on, and that brings me to the show that will open on Thursday at the Albert Barognan Gallery in Brussels, and there are some pictures already also on your own website.
Oh yeah.
Very quick with that.
Yeah.
And there, so Laurence, the assistant of Albert, told me that you are using for the first time like iPads, or like,
Yeah.
is this like as an interactive screen, or just like they are like
No,
new cheap?
It's a nice play. It's just, you know, the image quality is so wonderful on those, and I wanted to you know, kind of get away from the projections a little bit and work with the flat screen and the kind of pictorial space. So
Because what struck me was also like this picture. It's like, I think I don't know how big it is. It's a small drawing.
small drawing.
Yeah, it's like the painter is there. It was never away.
Yeah, I always did drawings and paintings and things like that. But the Glare schematic show was really is really kind of connected to the new piece, the Phantasmagoria piece, because if you go back to one of the so these they were almost the term schematic.
Was the glare?
Glare is a kind of reflection of, like when you look at that lens, the kind of light. So, like these kind of tendrils of light in a way. It's an invented term. It doesn't make any sense, but it's poetry.
The snake is back there.
Yeah, the snake is back, and so these kind of started out as I was thinking about. Of course, I always go back to psychology and connecting almost like analysis of one's fears and desires. And I was thinking about how the searches on the internet as a kind of construction of an idea and flow charts and so forth. And then I thought, well, this is always, it's also a kind of family tree in a way, a kind of genealogy, because in therapy or analysis, you know, you have iconic characters, parental figures, ancestors, spouses, children, connecting, but you also have an overlay of other more personal symbols. And so that's where this work sort of comes out of these new frontiers that are represented in the Phantasmagoria of kind of personalized schematics.
Maybe just to finish, I guess also a lot of people, it was also announced in this talk, this promotion of this talk, that you were, for the younger people, that you are the director of the video clip of David Bowie. We'll always talk about David Bowie. But give us maybe some nice anecdote about this, how he came up at your studio, and
Sure.
you also had to sign something. I read somewhere. It was very secret, those things.
Well, first let's bring David up here. David? Now there was some rumors that he's coming to the gallery. I first met David 97, 95, I guess. We were in an art exhibition together, and we did some videos for his 50th birthday at Madison Square Garden, which was quite a thrill because I was a big fan of his ever since I was a kid. My brothers and sisters, you know, we all loved him. And as people probably know, he was quite ill and went into a kind of, you know, seclusion for almost 10 years, roughly 10 years. And didn't make any music. I saw him a number of times during that time, but he just stopped talking about making any music or anything. And he
was always very much interested in visual arts, and
Oh, yeah.
contemporary art,
Yeah.
also as a collector. And,
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I mean, he's an artist. He's a multimedia artist, no doubt. He's made probably more images than many artists have, you know, so just a, so we really bonded on that, the kind of multimedia aspect. And he's also really interested in these kind of simulacra forms, puppets, you know, mannequins, things like that. And I mean, people might know this wonderful talk.TONY collaboration we did with David Bowie. That was on Saturday Night Live, where he has this puppet. It was always a great inspiration to me. So anyway, the long and the short of it was we ended up making this video to launch his new album, but it was very special, him being so attuned to the new technology. He decided to release it on YouTube without
8th of January 2013.
yeah, without any announcements at all. And I think that it was just a brilliant way to release it. You know, I remember staying up that night looking at it. Well, did it go on? Did it go on? No one saw it. You know, and then by the time I went to sleep. I woke up and I think 1 million people had seen it, and then by the next day it was like, I don't know, 4 million people or something. So it was quite a thrill.
It reminds me a bit of your works from the 80s, because it was like filmed in your studio,
That's
it's
nice.
almost like improvised, or is this wrong impression of me, or
Well,
done quickly in a day, or?
it was done over a week, and it was basically David's idea for the composition, and so.
And the footage came from him?
The footage, some of the stuff, the footage from cut off there. Yeah, the footage from Berlin was shot by him. Yeah, so it was a real kind of a collapsing of time, because of course the small figures, the little electronic characters there were from some years ago, you know, and he was like, that was like, because I probably, if it was my own video by myself, I probably would not have used those figures, you know. And there was some talk.
So it's a co-direction in a way. It was a real collaboration.
It was definitely David's fantasy. That was the wonderful thing about it. He had this fantasy. He wanted it shot in my studio. He loved to come over and see all the junk piled up in my studio, I think, you know, at certain times. And so he wanted it made in there. It's a kind of frame. But there's something about that which was special, because it was a deconstruction of itself as it was also making itself, which I really liked. You could see the heads going out of the frame there.
And one of we all know David Bowie on the right, but who's the girl on the left side?
The mystery woman, Jacqueline Humphreys,
Your wife.
my wife, abstract painter, a wonderful person and artist, which was, you know, I think in the Times in London they had like a quarter of a page in the newspaper. Who is the mystery woman? It was like, is it Marianne Faithfull? Is it Bjork? And I was like, no, that's the wrong video artist. So anyway, it was
revealed now.
It was also nice. It was interesting with MTV. The notion of the author was taken away, and I remember when they made that decision, it was almost like a legal protocol that MTV did, where there would be no credits on any of the videos. And that was a very strange move in terms of MTV, because basically that was the repository of the entire history of experimental film and video up to that point, and authorship was removed. But David, when we did this piece, you know, we were editing it, and he said, oh, well, at the end here it should say, a film directed by Tony Oursler, and I looked at it and I was like, are you serious? And he's like, that's
A
what
film.
you should say, a film. You got that, yeah. So I was like, oh, my experimental filmmaker friends will be really upset about this because nothing was shot on film in this whole video. And I said, okay, we'll sleep on it, David, and then if tomorrow you still want it on there. But anyway, it was quite a nice thing, gesture on his part to put my name on there. So I'm inextricably attached to the project, which is nice.
One last question that just pops up now, because you're also talking about the history, and you, a part of your practice is also kind of documentary. Yeah, take on it. You are filming, or you did film, like the history of the underground music scene in New York in the 80s, and all your friends that are really like talking heads, really like almost unedited.
Yeah.
Documentaries, and recently I just discovered the film because it was 1 month ago at the Whitney Museum, your 9/11 film, and I think not many people knows this, and maybe you have to conclude, to tell something about this 9/11 movie that you did.
You know, it's interesting you bring that up because I'm always trying to kind of push outside of the box of what people think your identity is as an artist. So when I made Synesthesia, these sort of documentary things, or the timeline, which was more pseudo-scholarly project, and then 9/11 was also, you know, Jacqueline and I lived right near the World Trade Center when that whole thing happened. And I just happened to have my camera, and I thought, well, I'll just have to make a documentary about this because obviously this event is going to change certain things in the world. And it also had a very palpable effect on, you know, I always key into people's psychological perceptions of things. So I noticed that after all this horrible stuff happened with the building, that people were visiting the kind of ashes that were still smoldering, and they were coming with all sorts of, you know, religious pamphlets and political things, and also to, you know, sort of help the firemen, even though there was nothing to do. And so this kind of, it was really like opening up a different side of American culture.
So part of your fantasy world that you were creating in your art was like becoming real.
Yeah, exactly.
In front of you in the streets.
Exactly. And it came full circle where in one part of the documentary I meet this guy who's got these, people were just, they were trading photographs of the event and printing them and selling them at Ground Zero. So I met this one guy who had like a whole series of images of Satan in the smoke of the World Trade Center, you know, so I thought, okay, it's come all up. Now I know why I'm shooting this, you know, it's opening things up. But,
okay, thank you. Yep. Are there some questions from the audience or the participants in this debate?
Nobody there.
might take a minute. I'm sure someone has them. They're just shy.
That's Belgian.
Don't be shy. I'm almost an official Belgianese.
I checked my notes if I forgot something. Oh yeah. I will. The first question then. I feel it. It comes from the audience, but because we are here in Gent and in Belgium, art history. And visiting the exhibition yesterday at M.A.K, also the Phantasmagoria, big installation. It reminds me also as a art historian to kind of medieval art sometimes, like the illuminations and manuscripts. But also, of course, being here in Belgium to our big painters like Bosch and Bruegel. And I was wondering what your relation is to those old guys, and here in the city of Jan van Eyck, mystic, lamp, altarpiece.
Well, I always thought that Hieronymus Bosch was like the first special effects artist. And I still believe that. I mean, I haven't seen his work here, but I've seen it. Of course, years ago.
Across the street.
Yeah.
You should visit it.
After this, for sure.
The variant cross.
But seeing that a lot of the work in Spain recently, I don't know how you guys let that go. You have to get it back. So for me, there's a connection in images of hell. You know, my son, I have a 10-year-old son, Jack, who plays the video game in the Phantasmagoria. And so, you know, the way that it works now is like a kid can get on the internet with a game with an Xbox, I'm sure you know, familiar with this, and they connect with anybody else in the world who's playing that game, and they kind of talk to each other and work together in killing the enemy, whether that's zombies or various others. And I shot the video of him playing one of the games that he likes, you know, killing zombies and whatever, hunting, assassinating people. And, you know, he asked me, well, Dad, why did you want to put that in the installation? And I was like, well, you know, it is kind of a contemporary image of hell, Jack. You know, which I think really confused him because he loves it so much, you know. But again, that's the kind of dichotomy of the new Phantasmagoria, that we're sending children into these kind of war fantasies. And I think you can only connect that to Bosch in some way or another.
That's for sure.
I have a question. A couple of years ago, you had a show at Oursler, and I remember that you had a piece of one of our older kings. Yeah. And I was wondering if you are familiar with the history of the country when you had a show at a particular gallery, or you just came up with the idea because his head was on a banknote.
20 francs.
20 francs. And I was thinking, how did you get the idea of, or did our king speaking?
Yeah, that series, it was a kind of provocative series of talking money that I started some years ago, and I've continued. I've done it started out with American money, of course, and I'm much more familiar with those presidents of America and some of the political figures there, but then also went right into the Queen of England, which I had speaking like kind of Cockney gutter slang, which very much upset people. People just wrote in the newspaper, the Queen speaks gibberish, you know, even though I did have some ideas about the Queen as a mother figure, and I kind of wrote in my personal perspective of the mother nurturing the British. But then that changed when I went to Beijing and did here's an image of the Chinese. And Mao, of course, being a real interesting figure, being such a heavy communist and then being so involved with the economics of the moment. There's a lot of irony there, but of course I had to just let him speak a version of the Little Red Book. So pretty much their excerpts of the Little Red Book there, because I really didn't want the exhibition to be completely shut down. But, you know, someone mentioned to me when I shot that one in Chinese, and of course in New York in Chinese with an actor, and then did these special effects. And I've often used the special effect of the money actually becoming transparent. You know, when you hold the bill up, and I love these kind of ghosty watermarks, which were particularly great in the older Belgian money with the atomium, I believe. But then when people came in to see the Mao, the first thing they said was, he has the wrong accent. I was like, yeah, it's really hard for me to get that right in New York, you know. So they're flawed pieces, so I apologize if I offended anybody.
Which language was our king speaking?
French.
I think it might have been even Flemish, I'm not sure. But
there is irony, but not a political
yeah,
criticism. It's just more ironical than a political statement.
I mean, it's kind of, I take these figures as iconic figures, and it's very personal to me because I would never think that I could really make an intelligent comment about what is happening politically in Belgium. I know this, so I avoid that, and I take responsibility for it.
But in a way, juxtaposition of a double taboo, the royal family or the king and money. And it's strange that we are not that much offended by the fact that we always, at that time, now it's different with the euros, but at that time always saw our king or queen or presidents on banknotes.
And, you know, I was also interested in these kind of paranoid relationship to money because there's always this kind of material aspect to the bill and the irony that it supposedly represents some kind of wealth from somewhere, but we don't really know what exactly that is. It's not gold anymore. And, you know, the way that when I started out with the American money, I was looking at people who fold the money in certain ways and hold it up and they can make like a nuclear bomb out of it, or they put horns on the president, or they see an owl and it's a Masonic image. And so there's this kind of paranoid reading of it, which is also of interest, not particularly in the Belgian one.
Probably there are some jokes in that kind of.
No doubt.
No more questions? Then, yeah.
You say your work at for the Vuitton gallery was political work?
I'm sorry.
At Louis Vuitton in Venice. Yeah. Interesting show there.
Political, you know, it was, no, I don't, maybe, yeah. Maybe political in the sense that all art's political in some way or another, but, you know, that work just to, for people who probably don't know what it is, it was a kind of interpretation of it was a response to a painting, which was a response to going back to the myth of Othello, or the narrative of Othello, and the story of the Moorish returning general and his inability to reconcile his love relationships and his ultimate demise in Shakespearean fashion. So my response to that was to think about the returning veterans in the U.S. and the kind of post-traumatic stress situation, because there's a great analogy to that, and the fact that we are in America now, like it seems to be a perpetually warring state, which I would never quite believe we'd be at that point, but we are. So in that sense, I guess it is political.
Some more questions? Somebody? Then I ask first. All right. As all artists, I guess. Yeah. No, I'd like to thank you, Tony, for this talk. I'd like also to thank my good friends from Max Grande who organized the show Tony Oursler in Grande. So it's really worthwhile to go there. It's always a fantastic place to visit. So I hope you get to see the show, all of you, and also, of course, the show at Albert Pavillon that opens on Thursday, and both go beyond New Year. So thanks for being here. Enjoy the museum, enjoy the shows of Rachel Harrison, Javier Teles, and Jordan Olsen. It's a full house, or a drink maybe at the bar.
Thanks so much. It's really important for me to be here. I mean, I can't tell you that all the times I came, you know, as quite a young man to Ghent, with my good friend Ron Bohez and Jan Hoot, and of course the red Gates. And so, you know, it's really wonderful to be here again and see the commitment to culture that is incredible here. My good friend Rachel Harrison having a show here in So it's great to see that it continues and continues. And so thanks for coming. And I hope that you have get over to see the show in Groningen. So they did a really great job of organizing it.
Absolutely, it's a wonderful show. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.